The following is a production of the Dallas Genealogical Society. For more information, please visit our website at dallasgenealogy.org.
So today, I would like to welcome Garry Finkell, who's the Vice President of Palatine's to America and has been very, very involved in the International German Genealogy Partnership and is a member of the board of directors of that. And as you know, the Dallas Society is a partner in this. And that's how I met Garry, by the way. And so his topic today is Hudson Valley Palatine Loyalists in the Revolution. So I'm going to stop sharing and let him start.
Thank you, Ann. Let me pull up my slideshow, but thank you very much for the introduction. And it's been one of the great things about the International German Genealogy Partnership is the chance to meet so many other people who have been just really doing tremendous work that we would not be aware of otherwise. We were always in our little silos, and this has been a great, really not even a side effect, but almost a direct effect of the organization. So, for starters, for those of you who aren't familiar with the state of New York in terms of the geography, we have two major rivers. The most significant is the Hudson River. It flows from straight north-south. It starts way up in the Adirondack Mountains, about 100 or so miles north of Albany, and then flows down through Albany right down to New York City, and then out to the ocean from there. It's hundreds of miles long, and it's been the core of the economy of Eastern New York. And the second river is called the Mohawk River that flows east and west, that goes essentially from the Albany area west to Buffalo. So I'm focusing on the Hudson Valley Palatine Loyalists in the Revolutionary War. I'll just give you my family tree, very brief, very small part of my family tree. But my ancestors, Johann Philip Finkell and Anna Katharina Finkell, I don't have her maiden name yet, came here in 1710, along with another 3,000 people, all from the Rhineland, not Rhineland in the sense that the Rhineland, but the Rhine River Valley, from the various states along the Rhine River Valley. And as I said, there were 3,000 of them that came in 11 boats. Some would say ships, but boats. And they ended up, after stopping in New York City, and that's a whole other topic, their whole journey from Germany to England to America. They settled in the mid-Hudson Valley between Albany and New York City, and they were followed by thousands and thousands of other Germans, all from the Rhine River Valley, in the following decades. So as I said, there were 3,000 of them together. I might mention that one of them was a man named Valentin Bressler, and his name was sort of corrupted, the last name was corrupted, and he ended up, some of his descendants had the name Presley, including Elvis. So Elvis was on the ships with my ancestors. That's one of my claims to fame, indirectly. So Philip and Katerina had 4 children, as you see here: Elizabetha, Philip Jr., Georg, and Margareta. And then Georg had 3 sons. He also had 5 daughters, and they're also significant. But we're going to focus just on the 3 sons. So I'm descended directly from Johannes Finkell, then Heinrich, Joseph Jeremiah, Daniel Henry, my grandfather Arthur Prescott, Arthur William, and myself, Arthur Garry. Most people don't know people know me for years and years, don't realize that Garry is my middle name, which is an Irish name because my mother's name was Garry. And then you see the change in the spelling of the name over time, and you also see the German names, German first names giving way to English names. So I had been always, I knew back to the name of my great grandfather, and Daniel Finkell, and we always heard that we were descended from a Hessian soldier. And I pursued everything in my genealogy work when I started becoming very serious about it with that assumption. And way back in the 1980s, there was an article in the New York Times about a woman who was the archivist for the archives in Hesse-Darmstadt. And she had done a lot of research on the Hessians who came over here, and many of them stayed. And so I wrote a letter to her and I said, was there a Finkell among the Hessian soldiers? And there was. His name was Ferdinand Finkell. And there was actually, it turns out there was a second one, Johannes Finkell, who were with the Hessian troops. And Johannes Finkell returned to Germany, whereas Ferdinand sort of disappeared. No record of whatever became of him. So my assumption for many, many years was that, oh, that's obviously our ancestor, Ferdinand Finkell. And yet a lot of things didn't fit in, to that timing, what his age was and things such as that. But I had nothing else to go on. So the uh, I started doing more and more research and start getting breakthroughs and going from one generation to another generation. And finally, I bypassed that era altogether and went, prior to the Revolutionary War and discovered Philip Finkell, Sr., coming here with Katerina in 1710. So I thought, well, whatever happened? What's with Ferdinand? And what's even more significant? What is with this legend of the Hessian ancestor? But there was another problem that came more recently. About 15 years ago, I started finding all these relatives, Finkell relatives in Canada. And if I could imagine like one ancestor, not a sibling of an ancestor going to Canada and, settling there, but there were just too many of these people. Like, why are there so many Finkells in Canada? And I have a third cousin, Don Finkell, who's lives in Tennessee. And he said, he was doing something. He said, I think our ancestors were loyalists. And that was a shock. It was like an identity crisis. Oh no, I knew nothing about loyalists. So I thought, oh no, what does that mean? Like, what do I make of that information? And yet, why are we in New York? We're not in Canada ourselves. So that, like I said, that was a real shock to me. And it was very difficult to deal with, again, because my image of loyalists were these kind of fringy people who were working against, the United States and things such as that. So, as I said, I'm bringing two facts together, the Hessian Finkells and the Canadian Finkells, or the Hessian Finkell and the Canadian Finkells. So I started reading more about the loyalism, and it turns out there's very little about loyalism. There's been very little research done on that whole topic after here we are 250 years later, and very little has been done on this. So I discovered this book that was written only in 2010, and this is an incredible book. It's really the first deep dive into the topic of loyalists. As you can see, it says Tories. And the subtitle is really striking, Fighting for the King in America's First Civil War. And he goes into all 13 colonies about the Loyalists. The Loyalists kind of varied from one colony to another in terms of their motivation, their background, what they did during the war. And it was really eye-opening to me. It's really an excellent book. Anyone who's generally interested in this topic, I highly recommend it. And I was talking to Bernard before we got on, and we were talking about the fact that it was a civil war, and in a way more of a civil war in the sense of brother against brother than the actual Civil War, the American Civil War, because you did have the geographic boundaries. So people in New York, for instance, would be very unlikely to have any connection to someone in Alabama. In other words, you had the border states, and then there'd be conflicts there between families. But here, you really were dealing with neighbors who were taking different positions. And so he talks a lot about the fact that the motivations really differed. The colonies were quite different from each other in certain ways economically, but even In our case, in New York and Pennsylvania in particular, ethnically. So there were a lot of Germans in New York and in Pennsylvania, especially also in other states or colonies, also Maryland and Virginia. Also, we had the Dutch. The Dutch really dominated New York. For even long after the British took over New York, the Dutch culture and the wealthy Dutch rulers really still ran everything here. So the division was quite distinct, and I'm going to I mentioned the other river valley, namely the Mohawk River Valley, and that history is quite different. And no one that I know of has ever done a real presentation on that topic. There are historical places in the Mohawk Valley related to the Revolutionary War. But I've never heard a talk about the Palatines during in the Mohawk Valley, and yet that was even more bitter than Hudson Valley because there was much more fighting out there than in the Hudson Valley, and families really divided. And to this day, when I talk to people in the Hudson Valley, I mean the Mohawk Valley, there's a bitterness that's really strange after all these years because some of their family became leaders of the Loyalist group, and obviously the ones who live there now are descended from people who fought on the Patriot side. So that history is quite different. Again, there were Germans. I'll go back to the Palatines. One thing I should mention is, if you're not aware of this, Palatine means pfalz, which means the Palatinate. That became a general word used by the British for all Germans. So we often talk about like Palatines to America was founded by people who were descended from the group that came in the 18th century. And so when I talk about Palatines, people often say, "Oh, your Palatines of America is for people from the Palatinate," and I say, "No, it's really for everybody." But they used the term when they founded the organization. Palatines, like I said, the English used that term for all Germans. And so they originally settled in the mid-Hudson Valley, as I said, but many of them went up into the Mohawk Valley. And it was their descendants who, as I said, really divided very bitterly and really in combat with each other. They burned houses, they burned churches. It was really brutal. We didn't have that kind of experience in the Hudson Valley, thank God. So this is from the book. And the fact this is a hidden facet of American history is the fact that many colonists chose to take up arms to defend their rightful ruler, King George III. And that's important to understand. That was their mentality. This is the rightful ruler. And so the exact number who bore arms will probably never be fully determined because in almost most, well, not since in most cases, many cases, they were exiled to different places based on what colony the Loyalists came from. They ended up moving to very different places, even to the Bahamas. There were Loyalist settlements in the Bahamas. My family ended up in much colder temperatures in Canada. So it says they believed as passionately in their cause as the Patriots. The stakes were the same, the rights as property owners and citizens of the land. As in any war, there were winners and losers. The Loyalists lost and soon found there was no place for them in their native land. America's loss was great. Canada, however, grew due to the talents and strengths of these men. So who are they? As I said, in this talk, I'm really going to be focusing on my family, but they really represent many other people who had the same experiences. But I know my family, in detail. So that's the way I'm going to focus it. So this document, which you obviously can't read too well, it's funny because I realized that when I've given this talk in the past, it was in a actual in-person meeting, and I was projecting this onto a big screen, and it's still difficult to read, but it's easier to read blown up than here. But what this is there was there's a small city called Rhinebeck, which is down in the area where Germantown was, where the Palatine settled initially in 1710. And this is the list of officers for what's called the Northeast Precinct of Rhinebeck. This is actually a town now, technically a town northeast in New York State. And this is interesting. I found a lot about the traditional English villages or towns had specific titles. So you had a supervisor, and then you had various other titles. There's the pathmasters, they're basically the highway department. And there's the poor masters, who are basically the welfare department. And so this is a list of the officers for what was the precinct, Northeast Precinct. And I don't have a date for this. There's an interesting story. My wife Lucretia and I went, this is maybe 10 years ago, we went to a presentation really about the history of Dutchess County, which is where Rhinebeck is located. And the presenter, who is the Dutchess County historian, put this thing on the screen, and we're all kind of looking at it, and vaguely. And Lucretia said, "Is that name Finkell?" And I hadn't even noticed it, and there was Philip Finkell. So Philip Finkell, who's Philip Finkell Jr., and I'll show you, right, I focus in on here. He was one of the poor masters, and Simon Kilmer, who was also was the other poor master. So apparently they had two poor masters, they had four road masters, and so this was a specific time. All these titles go back to the Middle Ages in England, actually. And most of the other people, in fact, I'd say all the other people here, as far as I can tell, were really English. So here you got these two Germans, and they're second generation. This is Philip Jr., as I said, and they don't have a date, but it's probably 1750 or thereabout, around 1750, I'm thinking. And so they were already part of the leadership of the community, even though, as I said, it was essentially an English-speaking community where this particular town is located, and most of the people on this leadership were either Dutch or English. So then I found this other document, which is from now this is strangely enough 1753. If you see, look up right here. I was thinking about how we often write years in terms of two digits. This is 26 in our, but apparently they use three digits. They dropped the 1,000. But this was 1753, and this is the same group, the same leadership, and many of the people are the same. Arnout Vili, who's right up here, is the supervisor. He was a supervisor in the previous list as well. I think he was Dutch as far as they can tell. But then right here again, it's hard to read, but so I separated this. This wasn't in your handout because I realized I needed to separate it. So now Simon Kilmer is not there. Now we've got Philip Finkell and Jury Finkell, poor masters. So Jury was in that era was a nickname for George among Germans. So it looks like June, but it's Jure, Jure. It was spelled, sometimes you see it Jurry. Things are spelled phonetically very much then, as someone felt comfortable. So Jury Finkell, George Finkell, that's my direct ancestor, and Philip, his brother, were the poor masters in 1753. So why were these Palatines loyalists? And it turns out, as I mentioned in that book earlier, the motivation and the justification and the rationale really varied a lot from one colony to another because they had different backgrounds and their circumstances were different. So in New York, the French and Indian War had taken place about 20 years prior. And it was a very real experience in New York because the French actually controlled northern New York, not just Canada, not what we know as Canada, but they very much controlled the colony of New York and western New York. So they really, in fact, that was, just throw this in, this is a separate topic again, but why did the people come from the Rhine Valley in the first place in 1710. And it was the British really were sponsors of that. The British were very afraid that the French would come down and just take over the rest of New York, because the population in the English-speaking part of New York was really small, and English people were no longer interested in coming to America the way they had been previously. And so the English felt they really needed a buffer against the French. And so they recruited Protestants, specifically Protestants, from the Rhine River Valley. So eventually there was constantly skirmishes. There were militias in the early and mid 1700s. There were militias throughout this area, and the Germans, the Palatines, were very involved with the militias, along with the Dutch and English. And there was real concern, as I said, with warfare against the French. And eventually there was the French and Indian War. And many of the Palatines took part in that alongside British military. So the people here had a very positive attitude toward the British and the British military in particular. They'd fought alongside of them against the French and they had been victorious. So that was one thing. This is very different, say, from Boston and Massachusetts, where everyone there was of English descent, essentially. But they had developed a lot of friction with the government in England over trade, and we know all about the tea taxes. I don't think I get no impression that the Germans drank tea, so the tea tax didn't mean anything to them. And a lot of those taxes that the especially the Massachusetts people and the Virginia people bristled against were actually imposed in order to pay for the French and Indian War. And so Massachusetts and certainly Virginia had nothing to do with that war. They're paying these taxes, and they really felt imposed on. Why are we paying for this war that really had nothing to do with us? Whereas the people here really were part of that war and actually were protected ultimately by defeating the French. So again, the whole different mentality toward the British in that context. Now, the German, specifically Lutheran philosophy of government was that you do not rebel against the legitimate authority. And so these Palatines, I said they're all Protestants who were brought here by the British. They did not allow any Catholics to come here because that was defeating the purpose against the Catholic French. Although some of them probably were Catholic when they came here, they just pretended to be Protestant. But the Lutheran philosophy of just warfare ruled out rebelling against your leaders, your legitimate leaders, and so that also played a part in this. And then the third thing, again, which is again, these are all very unique aspects to life here in New York, was the local aristocracy of the patroon system. So I've mentioned in passing the Dutch. So the Dutch first settled New York. So Albany was originally called New Rotterdam. It was called Beverwyck, which was a Dutch word. And New York City was New Amsterdam. You may already know those things. And the Dutch settled by setting up a real aristocracy. The Dutch West Indies Company gave what they call patents to very wealthy Dutch people. Some of them didn't even move here. And so some of the names were Van Rensselaer, Schuyler, and there was a Scottish family that came later on called the Livingstons, but they became very powerful, but they had married into the Dutch families. And so it really was almost a feudal society. All the land was owned by a very small group of extremely wealthy people. There was a list made like 20 years ago of the estimates of the wealthiest 100 people in the history of the world. And I think it was the 22nd wealthiest person in the history of the world was Stephen Van Rensselaer, next to Cleopatra. He owned just so much land. All of his wealth was in the form of land, but it was just massive. And so this was really an aristocratic environment in certain ways in terms of landholding. When the British took over, the Dutch really were not interested in government. The Dutch were more interested in trade and money. And so they didn't even resist the British when they took over. And the British, meanwhile, just left everything intact in terms of how things were run here. So a lot of the people in this area, and including the Palatines and some of the Dutch, not non-wealthy Dutch, had the attitude like King George is long a distance away from us. Meanwhile, we were dealing with our own aristocracy who imposed their will on us, and they're more of the enemy than King George. And for some reason, and I don't know why, no, I was reading that one of the books on the Loyalists, and they said no one can quite figure out why, but the local Dutch aristocracy decided to get on the side of the Patriots against the English crown. And so that, the fact that uh, the the local aristocracy was on the Patriot side actually pushed many of the other people to the Loyalist side. Because, as I said, they don't care about the king. He really has very little impact on them, but these people have a lot of impact on them. So these, as I said, are three unique things to this region. And as that book points out, other colonies had their own reasons. So the Battle of Saratoga, which is about 45 minutes north of Albany, was a major turning point in the whole Revolutionary War. In fact, I had seen at one point I was reading something about just Saratoga, and there's many historians consider the Battle of Saratoga to be one of the top most significant battles in Western history, which is hard to imagine, not because of the battle itself, but what happened was it brought the French in on the side of the Patriots. And that was, the critical turning point in the war against England, to have the French alongside. And this is what triggered that support, was the fact that the colonists defeated the British Army at Saratoga. So there were loyalist units included in these various groups. There was the King's Loyal Patriots, and there were the Queen's Loyal Patriots and things like that, and Jessop's Rangers with these various militias. Then that became one of the loyalist units. Now, what I mentioned too is that there were already militias going back way back to the early 1700s against the French, but the militias continued just for health, the protection of the communities. And during the war, there was a lot of flipping back and forth of these militias. Many of the militias would start out on the Patriot side and flip to the Loyalist side, and then others would do the opposite. So these units were often coming out of local militias that at first were probably loyalist in a sense because they were under the crown, but many of them had become patriots. And as I said, sometimes for different reasons, people went the other side. In terms of general issues, for instance, in terms of militias switching sides, when the United States, or I shouldn't say these states, the colonies, started to protest, like, we know about the Boston Tea Party, things like that. There were a lot of people who supported that, who were bitter and angry against the taxes and so on. But actually, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, there were a lot of people who then went to the Loyalist side. That was like a bridge too far. They did not want to separate from England. They were angry. They wanted the taxes removed. They wanted a lot of other changes, but they did not want to separate. So the Declaration of Independence actually forced a lot of people to go from being, say, protesters to the Loyalist side. And that's why some of the militias switched, especially at that point. So the Battle of Saratoga was truly, significant, as I said. And, there's you can read a lot about the history of the battle. It was very complex. The idea behind it, the reason it took place there, was that the British were sending troops down from Canada from the north, and then in from the western part of New York. And they wanted to, because there were, we don't think of this now, we have highways and roads all over the place, but Back then, there were very few roads connecting major cities. So one of the main roads went from Boston to Albany to New York City. And so the British knew that if they could capture Albany, they could stop the flow or really reduce. There were roads directly from Boston to New York City would have a huge impact on the trade and on movement of troops and all sorts of things. So the purpose of this invasion by the British was actually to capture Albany. And so the battle actually took place, though, in near Saratoga, not actually in Saratoga, but near Saratoga. And there was a side battle to the Battle of Saratoga. So the British troops in Saratoga had uh, a lot of Hessian soldiers with them. There were major Hessian units involved in that. And the British needed supplies because they'd already marched all the way down from Canada. They'd used up a lot of supplies, and the battle was going to take place, and skirmishes were taking place. So the British general decided to send one of the Hessian units down to Bennington, Vermont, which is right on the border. New York, this part of New York is right on the border with Massachusetts, Vermont, and Connecticut. So they were going to send a unit down um, to Bennington to basically take over, take supplies, and bring them back to the troops at Saratoga. And there's no documentation that I've seen, but the general thinking of that people who are talking about this topic um, had the Germans knew that there were German speaking people in this area. And so that's very possibly the reason they sent Hessian troops down, not British troops. The idea that maybe they would get support from the German speaking people in this area as they went down to Bennington. And actually, that was true. They really did have that kind of experience. However, they were defeated at the Battle of Bennington, primarily Vermont people who were much more English oriented. Not They weren't Dutch, and they didn't have the Dutch and German element, but the Vermont settlers were all English and all basically very influenced by Boston. They defeated this unit, and so that was another loss, and that added to ultimately to the loss of Saratoga. So what happened was, and I'll give you this first. When it was the British decided that they were going to surrender, it was in the evening, and they had started sending groups back and forth to discuss terms of surrender with the colonists and the British. And the British general realized that there was no provision for loyalists. So in other words, they had all these provisions for the British troops, the German troops. They're going to surrender. What would happen to them, and all of that. But there was no provision for the loyalist troops. And so he was very concerned that they could literally kill them, execute them. So he warned them, and many of them left in the middle of the night so that they didn't have to deal with what the repercussions of the loss. And one militia that had come out of Claverack, New York, which was north of Germantown, and a lot of the Germans by then were living in Claverack. I should mention that all the Germans at that time who came here were all farmers or rural people. Said rural occupations. They were farmers, and so the Claverack was sort of the community center of this big farm area north of Germantown. So this militia, the Claverack militia, that had been, again, a colonial side militia, and then became a loyalist militia, and they became part of Jessup's Rangers. This particular group literally walked to Canada through the forest, which is just incomprehensible, honestly. They had to avoid the roads because they didn't want to run into any colonial people who might be on the roads. So they really walked through the forest all the way to Canada. And the head of this group was Lieutenant Henry Simmons. Now, he himself was a Palatine descendant also. So he wrote a journal that's very interesting. He talks about where they stopped and all the experiences they had walking up to Canada, where they had no connections, of course, either. But among other things, he has his list of the soldiers he was with. Now, most of these soldiers were really like teenagers, 18, 19, maybe even 17, maybe 21. And so here's this list. And so right here you see Henry Finkell, and that's my ancestor Johannes's younger brother. And he was, christened Heinrich, but it's Henry here. And if you go down these names, you see a lot of Palatine names, like, well, Simon is really Simon. Bone Steel, the spelling is all over the map, but that's not the original spelling of Bone Steel. Reifenbergers, Hess, Hoffman, Becker, Eiselstein, Hagedorn, Hoffman, Bone Steel, again, Schertz, Lieb. So these are all, with maybe a couple of exceptions, Palatines. And even John Simmons, so Henry Simmons, the lieutenant, his brother John Simmons was the sergeant, and John Simmons was married to one of the Finkell girls. So you can see the family connections in all these things too. Now, what I should mention was, in terms of my family, Henry Finkell is here. He was at Saratoga. I don't know where my direct ancestor Johannes was in all of this. There was an older brother, George. I know he was involved in a skirmish earlier than Saratoga. But their father, George Finkell Sr., had been in the French and Indian War specifically. He had fought alongside the British, and he was an older man at this point, but he was very involved in organizing the Loyalists. So and that's why, of course, his own children were so involved in this. Now, there's another book, Loyalism in the Hoosick Valley. I mentioned the Hudson Valley and the Mohawk Valley. We have a lot of rivers in New York, and one of them is the Hoosick River. And so this is a book specifically on the Loyalists in this area. And the Lutheran Church in the Hoosick Valley, in what's called Brunswick, New York, it's a town of Brunswick, which is east of Albany on the other side of the river in Rensselaer County, was a hotbed of Loyalism. And to a great extent, that was because of this man, Reverend Johann Samuel Schwertfeger. So Pastor Schwertfeger had come from Germany. He was from Bavaria. He had studied in Erlangen, and he came here as a very, very German pastor. Many of the people at this point, we're talking, 1770s, a lot of the Palatines who were involved in the Revolutionary War were, it mentions it later on in his books, the second and third generation being in America. But Pastor Schwertfeger came directly from Germany with that same, I mentioned earlier, that Lutheran mentality about warfare and the fact that warfare should not be conducted against your own legitimate rulers. So this is from the book. The Gilead Lutheran Church played no small part in fostering Loyalist sentiment in the East Manor of Rensselaerwick. The pastor at Gilead, Reverend Schwertfeger, was a staunch Loyalist and made sure his parishioners knew their duty. So I mentioned the Battle of Bennington. Over 30% of the men who volunteered on the British side in the Battle of Bennington in August 1777 belonged to the Gilead Lutheran Church of Brunswick. Many never returned to their homes again. They went directly to Canada. There were second and third generation of Palatine Germans whose fathers had worked in the tar camps of Livingston Manor. And Franz Joseph Pfister commanded 500 Loyalist soldiers at the Battle of Bennington. 1/3 of his troops came from Gilead Lutheran Church. Pfister was a member of the church himself. So I'm going to be talking about what happened to them. Okay, the war's over now. And I will mention before I get to this point, these men, because of the defeat at Saratoga, ended up going to Canada. where the British were, and they actually helped out like with building ships and boats and things like that for the British Army. Um, but meanwhile, their families were left behind, and there was a law passed by the colony of New York that, or we should say, well, at this point, state of New York, technically, but really still a colony from the British perspective, that the families of the people going over to the other side, as they put it, should be expelled from their properties. And so they had the committees of correspondence and several other groups that kind of oversaw the legalism here. And they had a list of women whose husbands had gone over to the other side. And among that list is my fourth great grandmother, Elizabeth Finkell. Her name was Simon also. And in another, the wife of George Finkell, the Jr., and several other Palatine women. And so they determined based on this law that they should be expelled from the community. But they said they were going to hold off their decision. So they met again 2 weeks later, and they had the neighbors who were part of the Patriot side spoke up for these women and said that they were, good people. They were good members of the community. They were very nice people, and they were not a threat to the community. So they actually changed that decision and allowed them to stay until the end of the war. So I mentioned that, they ended up in Canada, and they all did. So there's a lot of documentation for these people. They were given allocations of land, but they also were putting in claims for what they lost, because they lost as I said, many of these people were landowners. They were farmers and things such as that. And so this is a list, these are 4 people's lists of things that they lost by being pushed out of their homes. And up here is on the upper left corner is George Finkell Sr., and he has a list of things, including things like shoemaking tools, all sorts of stuff, cattle. They lost the house, etc. And so they put it this claim. So this is the claim right here for in the upper left corner of George Finkell Sr., and then below it is George Finkell Jr. and what his losses were. And the British tried to recompense them as best they could. This is now what I'm going to mention later on, but this is actually grandsons. This is actually the my fourth great grandfather Johannes, George Sr.'s middle son. These were 2 of his sons. So in other words, George Sr.'s grandsons, John and Jacob, and they were given land also because of their connection to they were older sons, so they were somehow involved with this. So this is where they ended up. And it might not, for me, being a New Yorker, I know this map well, but this is the upper part of New York right here. And this is the St. Lawrence River with Canada on the other side, and feeding into Lake Ontario. And over here now is Toronto, and then there was a city, there's Kingston, Ontario, which is, the oldest city. And this is the area where Lieutenant Henry Simmons and Jessup's Rangers were given land. So the British actually cut up all the land along really the 2 water sources, the St. Lawrence and the Mohawk. I mean, I'm sorry, in Lake Ontario. I always said Mohawk, and Lake Ontario, and now you have to understand too that at this point Canada is ruled by the British, but it's really a French community. Everyone up there was French. The British had not settled Canada at all to speak of. So now suddenly you have this influx of English-speaking people. And this area was completely unsettled. This was all forest. I said the British gave them this land. Well, that was easier said than done because they had to clear all this. This was completely unsettled. This was like the wilderness of Canada. And it used to be called, at that time, it was called Upper Canada, which seems strange because it's really southern Canada in that southern Ontario. But they used that term in terms of the St. Lawrence River. So as the upper river, and say they call that Upper Canada or Upper Ontario. So they're all settled in this area, and they're given specific uh, pieces of land allocated. There was a lot of trading that was done because sometimes your piece of land was worthless, where it's located in swampland, and so people did a lot of trading of the land to kind of consolidate what their holdings were. Now, I mentioned Reverend Schwertfeger. His group, because they were not part of this whole Jessup's Rangers group here, they ended up along the St. Lawrence River up in this area. So these people get thrown out of America. They're considered traitors and things such as that. However, they are the founders of English-speaking Canada, and they're great heroes up there. They're the founding fathers and mothers of English-speaking Canada, and which is ironic too, because many of them were Germans, and yet they started English-speaking Canada. And so they are given the title United Empire Loyalists. So in the U.S., it's very prestigious to be a DAR member. Daughters of the American Revolution or Sons of the American Revolution. Well, in Canada, comparably, they have the United Empire Loyalists, and they have a coronet. It's a sort of a symbol that you can put on your family crest or whatever. I mean, because again, Canada still had that royal connection. The Americans went away from that, so the idea of a coronet in the U.S. is sort of strange, but in Canada, it still made a lot of sense. So to commemorate them, you have the 1934 stamp. So this was the war ended in 1783. So this exiling took place in 1784, and so this was the 150th anniversary of the founding of English-speaking Canada. And so this stamp commemorated that. And here's the 200th anniversary, 1984 stamp again, the Loyalists, as you can see, the Loyalists. And somebody would be curious in 2034 whether there'll be a stamp issued to commemorate that or something done in that regard. But it shows you the significance of these people in the history of Canada itself. And to be I haven't done this. I've kind of thought about it, but I could apply to be a UEL member, and it is very prestigious. I mean, people to this day will have their business correspondence. They'll have their name, and it'll be UEL at the end. I mean, I don't even think DAR people do that, on a day-to-day basis. But it's a very big deal up there. So here we have this commemorative plaque for Pastor Schwertfeger that talks all about his coming, being born in Bavaria and studying in Erlangen and coming here and all the things that he did to support the Loyalist cause. And this is again up along the St. Lawrence River. This is one of the landing spots. So again, this is a very big deal in Canada, these things. And so this is one of the landing spots along along Lake Ontario. Again, you see the 1784 when they had to do this, and it was actually very difficult. I mean, I can't describe how difficult it was for these people. They'd been thrown out of their own homes, literally, and which as that book said, the Loyalists book, that everyone knew this was going to happen. Essentially, that possibility existed. They're exiles. They have nothing. They've lost everything they owned. Now they have to land in this totally strange area. They have to clear the land. They came in on a bateau, which were sort of like almost big boats with that would just sort of be poled along the water or using oars. And it talks about it says a party of associated loyalists from New York State. under the command of Captain Michael Grass. And so they come down down the St. Lawrence River from Montreal down to this area. Now, this is a grave. So I went up there with my cousin Don Finkell in 2010, and this is one of many graves. You see this. This little thing up here, this British flag, was actually an indicator of a loyalist. Now, it was a member of the UEL, United Empire Loyalists. Any grave that has this means that that person buried there is part of that. So this woman's name is, I can't read it that well, but Hannah Fraser, and she was born. See us here, but she's born in Albany and died at Bath. Now, Bath, New York, Bath, Ontario is a small city near Kingston, which is a more somewhat significant city in terms of university, government, and history in Ontario. So you would see many graves like this where the person was born in Albany or in the Albany area, but was buried now in Ontario. This is another landing place, again, 1784, 250, United Arab, I keep saying United Empire. My modern history is entering in. United Empire Loyalists landed from bateau. Again, those bateaus were these big boats that they just kind of rowed or pulled along the water, and established the first permanent white settlement in Adolphustown Township. I've actually been up there, and it's just fascinating. I'll talk about that a little later. They had sailed from New York in the fall of 1783 under leadership of Major Peter Van Alstyne, which again is a Dutch name. Van Alstyne is a very, very well-known Dutch name in the Albany area even now. In fact, I know people with that name. And a loyalist of Dutch ancestry, and passed the winter at Sorel. So they started this church, Loyalist Memorial Church, Anglican Church in Adolphustown. And so the Germans now, Pastor Schwertfeger actually formed Lutheran churches in his community along the St. Lawrence River. But many of the others who ended up here along Lake Ontario, even though they were Lutheran background, the only church was the Church of England, essentially. So the Anglican Church, and that's what they became members of. Later on in the 1800s, many of them became Methodists. This is inside that church, and all along here are these tiles, and I'll show you what they are, to memorialize the loyalists who ended up in this community. So this is a closer look at some of these tiles. So each one of these tiles represents that doesn't represent it, names a specific loyalist couple, and their dates of birth and death, and they're all around the church. And then this one, I'm going to focus in on this one here. So this is Henry Finkell, UEL, and Lucretia Bleecker, his wife, also UEL. And so Henry, as I said, was the younger brother of my ancestor, Johannes or John. Ironically, my late wife's was Lucretia Finkell, and which seems like a very unusual name. Lucretia, always thought that she was the only Lucretia Finkell in history. And we've discovered she wasn't. That in the 1700s, there was a Lucretia Finkell. Henry and Lucretia had a daughter named Lucretia, and there are actually multiple Lucretia Finkells in Canada. But this is again his plaque, and all the ones around are for specific members of the UEL. So my cousin Don and I flew up there. Don is a pilot. He has a small, single engine plane. We flew up to Canada. One funny thing is we arrived and the customs people asked us why we were, coming, the usual questions. And we said, is business or pleasure? We said pleasure. And he said, what are you going to be doing? And we said, well, we're going to be going to archives and cemeteries. He said, that's pleasure. But for us, it was. And it was a great exploratory trip. And so here Don and I at Albany Airport about to take off. As I said, he lives in Tennessee. I wanted to mention too that why are we in the U.S.? Johannes and Elizabeth Finkell, our ancestors, returned to New York. I don't know why. I can't find any evidence to explain why they, unlike the rest of the family, actually came back here. But when they did come back, I mentioned that they lived in this community called Claverack. They moved to Brunswick. Now, Brunswick is not that far north of Claverack, but Brunswick, as I'd mentioned, Gilead Lutheran Church is in Brunswick. Schwerdtfeger was in Brunswick. So the people in that church were all loyalists. So essentially, what they did was they moved to a different community where they were surrounded by like-minded people. But I don't know why. We're the only ones of our family who came back here. And but that's why we live in the United States. Over the generations, I should mention too, uh, many of the Finkells from Canada eventually moved back to the United States. They moved to Michigan. There were several. There was one branch of that family that came from Canada, moved to Rochester, New York, and a few generations later, some of that family were fought in the Union Army in the Civil War. So that many of them did become Americans in the end. This is just landing. We landed at the Kingston Airport, which is a very tiny airport, to say the least. And if you go too far, you end up in Lake Ontario. So Henry Finkell, who was, as I said, 17 or 18 years old at the time of Saratoga, became a very prominent person in Canada. And all this was totally new to Don and me. We had no idea, until about 2010 that this was the case. And so this Finkell Shore Park is actually the community park for the city of Bath. And all the, municipal activities, celebrations that take place in Finkell Shore Park. So this was such a shock to us. We said we had no idea about any of this. And here's just a picture looking out on Lake Ontario. And Henry Finkell started at the tavern. It was the tavern in that part of Canada. And this is in the around 1800 when taverns were the center of everything. The courts met and the government met at the tavern. Besides, being a community center in general. And so it talks about him finding this in 1786. Henry Finkell, a Loyalist soldier, was the first tavern built between Kingston and York, Ontario. He built the first brewery, Upper Canada, again, that was called Upper Canada, and one of the earliest schools on this property. And then it talks about the first person to be hung was tried there and actually falsely accused. So that was sort of had nothing to do with Henry Finkell, but that's where the trial was held. And so it became the headquarters of Asa Danforth when he built the eastern section of the Kingston York Road, the first public highway in Ontario. But there's another element. Henry, because of when I mentioned that many of the loyalists went up to Canada while the war was going on and actually engaged in shipbuilding. So he actually created a shipbuilding business on Lake Ontario. And that business, that company built the first two steamships on Lake Ontario, which opened up Lake Ontario for trade. I mean, it had an incredibly just as the Fulton developed the steamship here in between Albany and New York City. He built these two, one being the Frontenac, and it had a gigantic impact on the development of the rest of Ontario. In fact, in the 1990s, Canada had a dollar coin that featured the Frontenac on the coin. And so here I am next to this monument about the steamship building on Lake Ontario. And so then we searched out an actual member of the family. And this is, Finkell lighting. This is done in front of the store, and it was just for us, it was just incredible to find these relatives we never even knew existed, never knew any of this background. And it was absolutely overwhelming, to discover this whole branch of our family, and as well as all the history that led to this. Lucretia and I went up there about a year later, just drove up there and visited them again. And here's, Paula Finkell, who's a fifth cousin of ours, and her mom. And they had a lot of information about the Finkells in Canada once they went up there. So that was it. It's been an adventure for me personally, but also let me just stop sharing. I love history. And so even apart from my own family, this was such a big discovery for us. And because again, the Revolutionary War is such a big deal in this area in general. And to find out all these things that I had no idea about has been fascinating. I, continue to read about it.
Wow, that was great. I think Bernard's they're opening up his mic as well here. They're in the library. I don't see any questions in chat. If anybody has any questions, please let us know.
Do we have any questions in the room? No? Do we have any Finkells in the room?
Well, I should mention, I didn't even think of this, of course, it's appropriate. I mentioned that Paula Finkell told me, about the Finkells in Canada. And she mentioned that at some point, saying, I don't know when, late 1800s, early 1900s, some of the Canadian Finkells moved to Kansas, and then some of them subsequently moved to Texas. So it's not out of the question that there'd be Finkells there. I've never really looked into that, but I should look into that.
Yeah.
I don't know what brought them to Kansas. I have no idea. And then in turn, I don't know what brought them to Texas.
So Marianne posted in chat, I saw a John Meikel listed on your Tories list. We had many Merkel, Merkle, Merickle go to Canada. Did you find any?
I didn't search for them, and I really that'd be another thing I want to do subsequently is find some of those other families and find out where they went. Because here in Albany, I know people with that name, and with Reifenberg, you saw that name, and many of the other names those Palatine names still exist here too. I should say that George, my ancestor George, the one who was the older man, but the Loyalist. His brother, Philip, who had been one of the poor masters, he died prior to the Revolutionary War. So he was not part of this at all. Meanwhile, his own family, again, this was third generation. As far as I can tell, none of them participated on either side. The general estimate is that there were about a third of the colonists, the British colonists, and the British and German and Dutch colonists in America, who were on the Patriot side. Roughly a third were on the Loyalist side, and another third really didn't participate. They just wanted to stay out of the whole conflict. So I don't believe some of my other Palatine ancestors were on the Patriot side. But I have not found any Finkells on the Patriot side. I mean, I've actually fought for them.
Bernard, do you have anything from Dallas?
No, nothing else here.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And was recorded, so it'll be on our website in probably a couple days because they usually process it fairly quickly. And so if you go to the website we showed you earlier, you should be able to find it there. Anything else, Bernard? Thank you.
No,
Okay.
that's it.
Okay.
This has been a production of the Dallas Genealogical Society. If you're already a member, thank you. Your fees have been supporting these and other society activities. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining now. Go to dallasgenealogy.org and click on the membership tab.